Gonna kick. That was funny. Well, so that other people can hear it too later. And Judea, by the way, one of the reasons we're recording it is that we have a lot of colleagues in Basel. And I mentioned to somebody, because I was in Basel last week, that we're going to have this talk, and they were like, "Oh, can we hear it too?" And then it's late, relatively speaking, in Basel, and we're like, "We will have a recording, so you won't miss all the fun." But it's nicer to be in a room together, and we also have a lot of people watching online. And so it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker. It's a really special treat for us, JUDEA PEARL. JUDEA is a true legend in the field of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and in particular for his groundbreaking work on the broad sense of causality, including his work on Bayesian networks, on probabilistic approaches in AI, on causality and on causal inference. And all of those things really shift both how we think and how we act today, all the way to what you see today in modern AI, including much of the work that we do today in Genentech and in GRED in order to advance our target discovery, drug discovery, and clinical trials. So JUDEA began his work when he joined the UCLA faculty, and he's still there today. He joined UCLA in 1970, and he's a founding editor of the Journal of Causal Inference. He's won many, many prestigious awards. So I'm just going to name a few. They include the 2011 Turing Award, which is essentially the Nobel Prize for computer scientists, the 2012 Harvey Prize, and the 2021 BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award. And there are really just a few. You can go on his wiki page and see many more. So we're super fortunate to have him come and talk to us today here in Genentech. We think the work that he has done and the way that he has helped people think about causality is incredibly important when you think about making medicines, because making medicines is all about predicting what might be the causes of disease, then finding things that if you create appropriate interventions would actually have a desirable impact, and then testing whether that impact actually happens where it ultimately matters, which is our patients. And so thank you very much, JUDEA, for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you for the great introduction, and I'm really happy to be able to speak today in Genentech. I understand that you you are in the business of making medicines, both in drug approval, drug discovery, and I have very little chance of talking to people in your circle, in your mode of thinking, because we in the university works with equations and you work with patients, and the two communities rarely communicate. I can tell you that because I've had a few interaction with people in the evidence-based medicine on Twitter, and the interaction was not pleasant. Namely, there is a miscommunication between the two communities. So I hope today I'll be able to convey to you a sense of a progress report of what I mean by what has been accomplished in the science of causal inference. And then I'll get a signal and I'll go to a personalized decision making. That's a new area that we have been working on in the past, perhaps 3, 4 years. That has to do with the personalized, as the title says, personalized decision making, or personalized medicine, sometimes it is called. And we realize that essentially every decision making is personalized, and we change the title to situation specific decision making. Every decision is made on the basis of the specific situation in which you find yourself, in which the surgeons define and the patients find themselves, and that's how real decision making are made. So I hope I'll spend enough time on this issue, and let me go straight to the outline. I'm going to do what I plan to do is first to convince you that new science is required to answer causal questions. But in order to do that, I'll have to give you examples of what I mean by causal question, and I'll demonstrate, I'll exemplify those questions. And then I'll go, once we agree on the science, I'll go to the fundamental laws of causal inference. What I mean that we have um, just two. Some people say one, but we can reduce them to two fundamental laws. Some people call them double helix of causal inference. That if you take them seriously, you can derive all your answers to all your questions mathematically without thinking, algorithmically, based on these two laws. It may sound pretentious, but not if you take into account that an accepted answer is you cannot do it. I mean, you haven't got enough assumptions, you haven't got enough data, and that is part of a great science, that it can tell you when you haven't got sufficient knowledge to answer the questions that you posed. I'll then go into 7+1 pillars of causal wisdom. I call them pillars because I think, who was it, Stephen Stigler, a historian of statistics, who wrote a book on 7 pillars of statistical wisdom, and he left out causality. So I would like to complement what he did with my own 7 pillars. Plus one will be the personalized decision making, and they will be a bunch of tools available for subset of causal tasks. So if you have a task which fall into one of those categories, you can use the tools that were developed from that task. If you know the tools for one problem in that category, you can solve all the others. I'll call them pillars of wisdom, and they will. Oh yeah, I'm repeating myself. The tools of causal inference, how they impact several application areas that we are familiar with, and then I'll go to personal decision making. Okay, I'm ready to go into my perception of what science is all about. This is my perception of a scientific paradigm as opposed to non-scientific paradigm, and I don't want to insult anybody, so I wouldn't say what I wouldn't name the non-scientific paradigm, but you can figure it out yourself. So the scientific paradigm has to do with a query. That's the first thing that is special about scientific paradigm. Any query you want to answer, normally if we are talking about quantitative science, then we want to estimate a certain answer to a certain query. For instance, the effectiveness of a drug. And then you have a model. This is something which is, I call the face of reality. It's something which is behind um, nature. That's how nature operates. We don't know that, but we have partial knowledge about nature. My perception of reality. These are the assumptions that I'm willing to defend about reality. For instance, that assumptions such as that the thermometer I'm using is well calibrated. It was just bought from a very reputable manufacturer. Okay, this is part of an assumption which I not always can verify experimentally, and or that for instance, that the sun doesn't listen to the rooster crow, things of that nature. Um, I'm willing to defend it, but and part of them can be testable, but only once we have a data. So look at it box. That is a calculus box, and it has three inputs. It's three arrows coming in, and there is one arrow coming out, and this is the solution, the estimand. It is a expression in probabilistic term telling you to what degree I can say yes to the questions that I posed at this point. Okay, so these three areas include on the left here, you see, data. And the data is only one of three inputs. And this is what makes causal science different than data science. In data science, you have only one arrow, data coming in, a solution coming out. And here we are talking about things like query, things like partial models, and notice that in the data I put down together with the method at which the data was collected. I will put an asterisk if the data was collected from experimental studies or from observational studies. So that's important to include the method of collection. Good. Now we have three inputs, one output, and let's try to, number one, exemplify how this box of science operates. And we'll say that a problem is solvable if my model permits the calculus to express the query in terms of the available data. The calculus determines if I have enough assumption here so that the query can be answered probabilistically in terms of the available data. Good. Let's see how it works in real life, and we'll go straight into what I promise you. Typical causal question. Let's see, how effective is a given treatment in preventing a disease? No second, no other word than necessary. We are familiar with it. Now, was it the tax break that caused our sales to go up, or our marketing campaign? See, this is a different than predicting the effect of intervention, because this has to do with the thinking backward and say, I've seen the outcome. Our sales went up. Is it because our marketing campaign was so creative, or simply because the tax break caused it? Even another example, what is the annual healthcare cost attributed to obesity? It was an issue, I think, 3, 4 years ago in the New York Times. Can we estimate the healthcare cost attributed to obesity? And notice that obesity is not an, a variable that can be manipulated either by experiment or by trickery. Okay, so it has its own character. Can hiring record prove an employer guilty of sex discrimination? It has to do, of course, with the ethics and of uh, issues, especially today with AI. People are concerned about fairness and the biases introduced by the data, especially when the data is concerned with text that generated by LLMs and other methods today. So this is also an important issues to deal with discrimination of fairness, and we'll see that this falls under the category of mediation. And the fifth one, it's a personal kind of question. I, as a person, am about to quit my job. I have had it. Will I regret it? So I'm posing that as five types of causal question. I'll justify why I call them question, and I will explain why the yellow painted relationships there are in yellow. What makes them in yellow is the fact that they cannot be articulated in the standard grammar of science. I'm not talking about solving. I'm not talking about estimating. I'm talking even articulating. Just posing the question in the mathematics of conventional science is impossible, and I can convince you immediately by showing you that science is married to the equality side, whereas these relationships are asymmetric. So look at down here. I have an equation y is equal to ax, and the equality sign has a beautiful feature that it works both ways. If you know x, you can compute y, and if you know y, you can compute x by dividing by a, right? So equality sign express a symmetrical relationship, whereas all those marked in yellow involve non-symmetrical relations. Just think about the first one, okay? A drug or treatment is preventing a disease, and disease does not prevent the treatment. Okay? So we need to deal with a new kind of asymmetrical relation that will capture the asymmetry you and I see whenever we talked about those relationships. And we have such operator which is asymmetric. In computer science, we call it assignment. We take the content of a certain register in a computer and assign it to the another register called Y, which is different than equating the two. And indeed, everything that I'm going to say can be looked at as an attempt to build a mathematical framework for the assignment operator, replacing the equality sign in traditional science. That's all I'm trying to do at this point. And what I'm going to offer you is indeed what I think is successful attempt to replace the equality sign with the assignment sign. The assignment means that nature looks at the value of x and nature assigns to another value y the outcome of that whatever the value of x is multiplied by a, and that is, I'll give you an example. Let's say the temperature of my iPhone at this point is 25 degrees Celsius. How does nature compute this quantity, 25, not less and not more? By looking at the other variables in the room, including the speed of the molecules rushing out of my mouth and the radiation coming out from this bulb and other variables. So nature is looking at all those variables, listens to them, and that's an important um, asymmetric relation. Nature listens to them, compute, goes through some process of computation, and the result of that process is assigned to the temperature of my iPhone. So this will be my perception of science. It will be a community of listening agents. A society of listeners, I sometimes call it. Good. We are on our way. Let's look at some example, and I'll give you straight the two fundamental laws of causal inference. Since this is a fundamental law, I have to explain it. I'll explain it later by exemplify it, but I just want to give you the flavor at this point. What do I mean by that? First of all, we'll see that counterfactual are the building blocks of this science. So I have to define what a counterfactual is. Counterfactual means, for instance, the temperature would be 40 degrees had this bulb been 5 kilometers away. Let's look at this counterfactual, okay? The temperature here will be 40 degrees. Now it's 30. I sometimes know the current value of the outcome, but I look at the outcome and I say, y sub x means the value that y would attain had another variable, capital X, taken on a different value than it has now. Small x, it's a constant. For the situation u, now I can compute it. Essentially, it's very embarrassingly simple to compute it. What you do is you take your model, m, and instead of the equation that currently determines x, you replace it with a constant, and then compute the outcome. So simple. And that is the nature of the first law of counterfactual. The second one I'll explain it by example. So we are on the way. The second one is derived from the first one, and it tells you that nature is gracious to me because it has given me the ability of telling when my data is compatible with my model. Whenever I see separation in the graph that correspond to my model separation, I know that I should expect to find conditional independence in the data. So it will allow me to test for compatibility. I'll continue Bing and exemplify what I mean by the first law. Collection of functions. That is what my model is. This is my original model, tells you that W1 is related to Z1 by a certain function, namely that W1 is an outcome whose arguments are the value of Z1. So here's a collection of functions. And now I'm asking a daring question. What would be the outcome? Why had x been not its current value, but some other value, small x? That's what you do. You remove the arrow that currently point into x. These are the equations that currently determine the value of x. And you replace it by a constant and you compute the value of the outcome in the mutilated model. Could anything be simpler than that? Nothing. So here I have defined what a counterfactual is. I'll demonstrate it in a second. So counterfactual are embarrassingly simple. I'll demonstrate it and so are interventions, because interventions are just a species of counterfactual. If I have to intervene and change the value of x to small x, I'm asking what is the value of the outcome y if I do x, and I can express it in terms of counterfactual. What will be the value of the outcome y had x been small x after my intervention? Okay? So this is just a species. There are counterfactual questions that cannot be expressed in terms of intervention, and these are more sophisticated, but at least the interventions are a species of counterfactual. Okay, we are on our way. Here's an example. You get up in the morning, you find that the pavement is wet, and you know it could be rain, it could be the sprinkler on. A sprinkler is determined by the climate, the rain is by the climate. So you have a collection of functions among those four variables. Here they are. You see how I express them? In most cases, we would not know the function, but we know there is a function because the sprinkler is connected to is listening to the climate, and the rain is listening to the climate, and the wetness is listening to the sprinkler and the rain. So I put down um, undetermined function. I give them even a subscript to tell them where they lie. So this one, for instance, just said that W is a function of S, R, and some fudge factor, some idiosyncratic noise factor that might not be included in my model. For instance, there could be all kind of additional reasons why the pavement is wet. Maybe the neighbor's dog came to take a walk on your pavement, and this at this moment. So we have a fudge factors, error terms, they call them in economics. Okay, I call them. They make the situation unique. Okay, so now we have this is an example of a collection of functions, and how do I compute things? Well, first, there is a miracle here. A miracle happens that if the U's are independent of each other, and then the observed distribution PCR of all the variables that I'm concerned about in my model, they satisfy constraints that are, number one, independent on the function, independent also on the probability distribution of my error terms, and they are readable from the graph. And this is, I call it a miracle, because without it, I don't think we could have gotten anything useful from the calculus. And let me show you, for instance, here there is a missing error between C and W. So I know right away that there should be some conditional independence in the data that I can test for. Here, for instance, C and W are independent if I should condition on S and R. I write it like that. Independent condition on C. The applications are, and here's another one, and that determine that S and R are independent on C, not on W for a reason that I wouldn't elaborate it. It's called a collider, but the applications are enormous. First of all, we can do model testing. Number one. Number two, we can do structure learn. We can look for collection of all the structure in the world that are compatible with the data that we obtain. And if we do structure learn, perhaps we can answer the question, interventional kind of question, by adjustment. And whether we can answer them in the subset of compatible model. We can even have a symbolic calculus for intervention, and that is what I'm going to show you. That can, with the help of these miracles, we can reduce questions about interventions and then later on counterfactual to symbolic calculus. So you don't have to have me coming a lecture to you. You can all do it yourself straight by simple procedure, looking at your assumptions and the data that you have. Okay, if you take seriously this perception of science and you look at the calculus that evolved from the first law of causal reasoning, you find a strange hierarchy that you have three layers, that questions in layer I cannot be answered unless you have information from layer I or higher. So, for instance, you cannot answer questions about interventions here if you have only statistical data in terms of non-experimental data. So here we have statistics. Okay? Seeing if I see something, what can I change? What can I say about my belief in another variable, why? What do symptoms tell us about the disease? What does the survey tells us about election results? This is all straight statistics, very sophisticated science. I'm not minimizing it. I'm just saying that is in itself, it's not sufficient to answer questions about doing or intervening. If I take an aspirin, will my headache be cured? You can do it if you have experiments, and this is what I mean by level 2, including experiments. There are some questions in which you cannot, important questions that you can ask and you cannot answer with the experimental data alone. You need to have something additional to that. These are assumptions, counterfactual assumptions. They lead to what we call imagining, retrospection, understanding, explanation, and so on. What if I had done things differently? What if X, what was it X that caused Y? We discussed some of them. The classical one, uh, would Kennedy be alive today if Oswald had not killed him? What if I hadn't smoked for the last two, 2 years, knowing that I did smoke? So let's go and exemplify what we can do in a 3 level. And it's very important to know at which level you are. Some people call that the DNA of causal reasoning, because if you know where you are, you know what assumptions you must make in order to be able to solve your equation. And you know what, if you don't get an answer to your question, you know the reason. Uh, so the hierarchy is important for organizing your thoughts and your data. I'm now going to go to the 7 pillar and show you how they work and what we can do and what has been done in each layer for the benefit of science. So tool number 1, encoding causal information in transparent and testable way. Just encoding what you know about the world in a way that is communicable to your peers in a very transparent language and in a testable way. Number 2, predicting the effect of action and policies, as we saw and we'll see in a minute. And third, computing counterfactual and finding causes of effect. Not only effects of causes, but causes of effect. It has to do with attribution, as exemplified, explanation, susceptibility. Tool number 4, computing direct, or distinguishing, I should say, direct from indirect effect. This is a collection of problems that we call mediation. They have to play a major role in defining fairness, inequities, and discrimination, because in many cases, the direct effect is considered to be forbidden by law, whereas the indirect effect is fine. It's not the responsibility for the employer or the whoever is being scrutinized. Tool number 5 will be integrating data from diverse sources. And this is something really that should be known in the field. And it's I constantly see that this collection of results is not known in the field of experimental results. And that's a shame. We call it fusion or transportability. In the machine learning circles, they call it transfer learning. And science is all about transfer learning. You find things in the laboratory and you would like to believe that some of your findings are still applicable to the field. And the field differs from the laboratory in many ways, and some of them are irrelevant and some are irrelevant. And the relevant makes not every finding generalizable to the field. Some are and some are not. And to be able to take data that coming from diverse resources and fusing them together and answering a question about another environment, similar but not exactly the same as the ones from which the data arrive. This is the study of fusion. Tool number 6, recovering from missing data. And missing data is prevailing in every field of science because you simply, patients don't like to divulge certain kind of data, like the income of their parents, and patients forget things, innocently forget their experience. So you have an unknown in your table, in your data table, and the question is, can you recover answers to your query from missing data? I'll show you some results, or I'll summarize some results. Then we go to causal discovery. This is taking seriously the ability to find subsets of compatible models and work with a subset instead of one model. The last one comes with personal decision making. I'll spend a few minutes on that. And now we are ready to first exemplify some of the things so you wouldn't think that I'm talking in the air. Nope, I should skip pillar 2. Look at control of confounding. Look at a simple question. Determine if a desired causal relationship can be estimated from data and how. The solution is reduced to a game. Now, we have procedure, such as backdoor, leads to adjustment for covariant. Which covariant should be adjusted for in order to give you the desired answer to your query? There is the effectiveness of a drug, for instance. Okay, we have front door. A certain structure allows you to do non-standard adjustment. And then the question is, do calculus predict whether the assumption that you have, regardless if they fall under backdoor or front door, if they are sufficient to give you the effect of policy interventions given the assumptions? So the do calculus, maybe you heard about it. If you read the book of why, then it is in one of the chapters, not amplified, but he just mentioned it allows you to predict the effect of policy from observational data whenever it's feasible. It just tells you, yes, it's feasible, no, it's unfeasible, it's not feasible, infeasible, you say, right? But it's complete. Okay, this is pillar number 2. Pillar number 3 is we algorithmatize counterfactual. Given model and data, determine what Joe's salary would be had he had one more year of education. It turns out the probability of every counterfactual can be computed or bounded using the surgery procedure which is expressed and described in the first law of counterfactuals. So sometimes you don't get a point estimate, but you get a bound. And corollary, causes of effect and attributions are formalized. Let's look at a typical attribution question. It comes in the legal domains. Your Honor, My client, Mr. A, died because he used this drug. So you have to assign responsibility to the manufacturer of the drug, and the family is demanding compensation. Okay? And the court of law has defined under what condition the family is deserving of compensation. The court has to decide and listen to the language of the court, not my language. Lawyers speak counterfactual constantly and listen to their jargon. And the court must decide if it is more probable than not that Mr. A would be alive but for the drug. So the court has to compute a probability, more probable than not. But we are experts in probability, right? So let's put it down in probabilistic terms, but we can't unless we use counterfactual. Because if we put here probability of alive, given that actually he is dead, or probability of what if he didn't take a drug, given that he actually took a drug, we get zero. No, we have to use counterfactual. The probability that he would be alive had he not taken the drug. And listen, look how I put it in the subscript to make sure that we understand it's counterfactual probability and not conditional probability. And then I condition it on the two things which I know for sure. Mr. A is dead. Mr. A did take the drug. And we have to compute this strange probability. And indeed, sometimes we are lucky, and the data, combination of data, gives us probability 1. Under this condition, we say the guy is guilty with probability 1, and this happens. I exemplified in my book and in many other papers. Sometimes combined data taken from different sources tell us more than each study alone. And here the example that I use is combining experimental with non-experimental data. The combination of the two gives you a bound which is 1. Well, the window of the bound is 0, and it's situated at 1. Under these conditions, we get a conclusion that it's so hard for statisticians to swallow that they all nod their heads and said impossible. And I'm defending myself by referring back to the calculus. The calculus says he's guilty with probability 1. Okay, let's go to pillar number 4. It's mediation analysis. And mediation has to do with decomposing, distinguishing direct from indirect effect. Why is it important? We have the following task. We have data and model. We have to unveil and quantify the mechanism that transmit changes from a cause to its effect. Mechanism. The graphical representation that we have of counterfactual can tell us when direct and indirect effects are estimable from the data. And if we can estimate them, then we can answer the question, how necessary is a mediation between the cause and the effect? How necessary or sufficient is the mediation for the effect? And this is what I mean by to quantify the mechanism that transmit changes from cause to its effect. I'll give you an example here that have to do with discrimination. Here's gender and here's hiring. So we asked a natural question. Can we determine can data prove an employer guilty of hiring discrimination? Or another way, asking what is the direct effect of gender on hiring? Why I focus on direct effect? Because if the hiring disparity that we see is due to qualification disparity, then the employer is exonerated. The employer is not responsible for the inadequate, for disparity in the population, that the ladies have a certain qualification which do not fit the requirement of the job. That is not the responsibility of society and education, perhaps, but not of the specific employer. So we need to distinguish that line, direct effect, from the mediated effect. Well, one can say, let's condition on M. Wrong. If you adjust for M, you get the wrong answer. You get what is called the direct, forget how we call it, conditional direct effect. And that is the reason it's wrong is because you might have some hidden hidden uh, path, namely you have some hidden covariates that affect both M and Y, which are not in the model. And then if you condition on M, you create colliders and you do not actually eliminate the effect of M. You amplify it. Okay, this is all part of the calculus, so I don't have to spell it. So the legal definition, if you look of direct effect or the of discrimination, goes like that. Find the probability that the employer would have acted differently had the employee been of different sex and the qualification had been the same. Notice the jargon that the lawyers use. You have three different counterfactuals here. They are nested. Would have been different had the employer been different and qualification had been the same. It's a nested counterfactual that luckily the calculus of counterfactual can resolve and give you an answer. So I wouldn't get to that and just tell you there is a calculus that gives you the correct results. Now let's deal with the issue of transfer learning. The task is like that. A machine trained in one environment finds that the environment condition changed. When and how can it amortize past learning to the new environment? And the solution, we have a complete solution obtained through the do calculus using what we call selection diagram. These are diagrams that encode all the reason for the change. And that's important because if you just know the surface change and not the reason for the change, you cannot answer the query, and we can prove that you cannot answer. Namely, two identical changes in the probability distribution can give you ambiguous results for your question. So we need to know the reason for the change. I'll give you an example of how it looks in sort of real life, assuming that you have here data coming from different cities, okay, different hospitals, New York, Los Angeles, Boston, and each location had its own idiosyncratic character. For instance, in Boston, you have mostly successful lawyers, and you know that successful lawyers act differently than, say, a younger population or, uh, say, homeless. So in San Francisco, we have another idiosyncratic character. We found that they have a post-treatment blood pressure, high blood pressure, and things of that sort. Or you have data coming from 6 different hospitals, and you want to find the causal effect of treatment on outcome in Arkansas. And Arkansas is not included among those sources. Can you do it? Well, not in this term, because here it looks undoable, but not if you formalize it in terms of selection diagram. Look at that. What is it, the selection diagram? It tells you. Look at that, for instance. It tells you everything is the same, between the Arkansas and the source, this location, except for the effect of some idiosyncratic variable S that we don't know, we don't observe, but we know there is some idiosyncratic character in maybe Boston on W, which in itself is an intermediate variable between the treatment in effect. So we know only that much. But once we are able to organize them in a form of graph, it becomes half formalized, and that's enough for us. Under this condition, we can come and say, yes, we have a calculus that tells you, yes, I can calculate the causal effect in Arkansas based on what you're telling me about these seven, what are they, seven, eight, okay, hospitals, given only those conditions and not knowing S, but I can tell you yes or no whether we can compute the causal effect of Arkansas, or I can come back and say, sorry, you haven't got enough information. You cannot combine them. You have to improve the assumptions of at least one of them and so forth. Okay? So under this condition, we can compute, and that's called fusion. I'll give you the results. Oh, no, I'm not finished here. The result is that this calculus is complete, was published in the proceeding of the National Academy of Science, so it's available for everybody to enjoy. Pillar 6 is missing data, as I explained to you that here's an example of a table. You have data, but in some entry, instead of having ones and zeros, I have, sorry guy, data unavailable, missing, M. Okay? Can you now answer the query? Let's say I want to condition, let's say I want something very simple. I want to find the probability distribution of X, Y, and Z. Under this condition where I don't have these values, I would like to compute it as if no data was missing. You see what I'm saying? No, as if no data was missing. So I cannot do it straightforward, and some people do it by all kind of gimmicks. But we have a science behind it. It tells you that this is the correct answer, and I can tell you when we can do it, when we cannot do it. Under certain condition, we can, and certain condition we cannot. We don't just run imputation algorithm and hope that they will converge. No, we can tell ahead of time when we can solve the problem and how to solve it. So we have a model-based answer that tells you this. Sometimes there is no model blind estimator, and sometimes we can tell you there is given a model, giving a missingness model, namely a model that explains why is it missing. We can tell you yes and no and how. Okay, I think I've reached the point of where I need to go to the need to go to cause to deal with the personal decision making. Okay, what do I mean by personal decision making? I want to compute the probability that a given individual, I'll call him Mr. U, okay, would benefit or harm by a given treatment, okay, as opposed to what we normally compute and we normally estimate by everybody in the field, the average recovery rate in the subpopulation resembling the individual. So look at the two requirements. Here I'm talking about an individual, and I want to know the probability that this individual will benefit from a treatment. And here I'm asking a different question. What is the average recovery rate for subpopulation resembling the individual? Okay. Two different questions. Unfortunately, we all got accustomed to deal with the second one, and we forget that what we really want is the former one. They even have a different symbolic signature. For those of you that are familiar with the notation, look at just the difference between the two expressions. Don't if you don't let it let it go. But if you do, look at the symbolic signature. Here I'm talking about characteristic of Mr. U. Okay, collection of things that I know. He is a male. He has the college education and so on. So these are the characteristics of Mr. U. Given those, here I want to find the probability, P, that Mr. U would recover ahead if he takes the drug and simultaneously die if he doesn't take the drug. Okay? It's a conjunction of two hypothetical situations that I can never measure simultaneously because in real life I can only see what happens to Mr. U once he takes the drug or once he doesn't take the drug. And I can never see what happens to him or her under the conjunction of these two situations. But still, we gather courage and we would like to estimate it with the help of our calculus. And I'll show you that we can do that. Not always we can get a point estimate, but we can get a bound. Sometimes the bound shrinks and are becoming very informative. So compare this to what we normally do in experimental studies. We take Mr. U, we look at its characteristics, and for this kind of subpopulation, we want to find the average of those that recovered and those that did not recover. This is not what we want to measure here. So there is a difference between the two, and let's get an example. Who cares about the difference? Let me show you an example where it makes a difference. Take, for example, the question whether what is the model behind, assuming that you have a drug that shows no effect whatsoever in the experimental study. So you have 10% people die and 10% 10% people die under in the control and 10% die under the treatment arm. So I would say that the drug shows there's no treatment effect on people in this subpopulation. Can we tell the difference between the two underlying models? One says that the drug is just a sugar pill that doesn't affect any individual, or that the drug kills 10% and cures another 10%, and the two cancels in the experimental study. Can we tell the difference? And I've just told you that we cannot do it in experimental studies because you have a cancellation effect. Right? So experimental studies will not tell you whether or not the drug doesn't affect any individual or not, or it affects some and not others. So let's ask the question: Who cares? Does anybody care if the model is a sugar a pill or the real model is a drug that kills some and cures some? Well, let's look at some examples. In model one, the drug has no effect. Okay, so then these two subpopulation, those that get harmed and those that benefit, cancel each other, and you get in model one you had zero. Oh, cancel each other. Here, this is model two, and this is model one. Can we tell the difference between model one and model two? So we understand now what the difference between the two models are. Experimental studies will not tell us the difference because the two can't. But who anybody cares about the difference? Some people say that the policymakers, for instance, should not care. Let's see. How about the individual, the patient, him or herself, for whom the difference make? Model 1, no effect on any individual. Model 2, save 10% and kill 10%. Well, look at the patient. In Model 1, it's useless, but could be safe. So if it has some pain relieving property, I would take a chance. I would take it. But Model 2 is scary. It could be scary to some, because come on, you have 10% of being killed by the drug. Or it could be a lifesaver. If you feel that you belong to the people who are cured, so perhaps you should take a risk and take the drug, depending on what you believe about yourself, your family members, and so forth. So it makes a difference for you whether or not the drug is a type 1 or type 2. How about the policymaker? Some say if you are an administrator of a hospital, you don't really care about the difference between the two. If you have Model 1 or Model 2, you only care about the population efficacy of the drug. How many people you can brag upon at the end of the year and say, we have so many people alive. But that's wrong. Because imagine that autopsy shows that 10% of the people treated in this hospital could have been alive had they not taken the treatment. What does it do to the reputation of your hospital if autopsy can reveal that 10% was mistakenly treated and could have been alive had they not been treated? So you're also concerned about the if you're concerned about the reputation of your hospital or the entire maybe California healthcare systems, you should be concerned about the difference between Model 1 and Model 2. And the third one is a researcher. We as researchers, we are asking if we can differentiate between Model 1 and Model 2. Then we can look for some markers that make the differentiation possible. And those markers may lead one into understanding of the underlying mechanism that makes the difference that transmit the causes from the treatment to the outcome. Good. So we have three types of stakeholders that are concerned about the difference between Model 1 and Model 2. And how I would like now to show you how we can do talk about utilities in decision making in order to utilize those bounds or that calculus of counterfactual that allows us to assign to quantitative to quantify these questions. Good. So in general, the probability of benefit or harm for a given individual cannot be point estimated from population down, but it can be bounded. And that's what we're after. And we find that the bounds shrink when both experimental and observation data are available and we combine them judiciously. Why? Because the Model 1 with no effect can be ruled out if we find no death in the whatsoever in observational studies. If we find no data and we know that somehow the people in the experimental studies who are choosing the drug on their own volition have some premonition or some knowledge about themselves or related variables about themselves, which allows them to predict and to stay away from the treatment. So here's an example of how just looking at the observational study alone can tell you that we can rule out model one. The mathematics, however, gives you tight bound on benefit for any combination of RCT and OS. OS stands for observational studies. That good. And further shrinkage can be expected when you have structural information about who causes what, like the graph we talked before. Okay. And we can talk about assigning utilities in the context of this very practical issue. Look at the issues of patients and needs. Imagine that you have a bunch of patients waiting in a reception room of a hospital, waiting for treatment. You would like to provide hospital bed to those who are in greatest need, as opposed to those who will, for instance, be cured on their own or that are doomed and no matter what you do to them, they will be dead. So counterfactually, we say find the patients which has the highest probability of that nature, probability of benefit, which we saw earlier, right? Who will improve if and only if treated. Find those people. So we have the calculus tells you that combining observational and experimental studies allows you to rank order the patients that are waiting in the reception room and find out who deserve a treatment better than another. It might sound cruel, but this is life under limited resources. And this is a general question that comes in many, many problems. For instance, we call it situation decision, specific decision. It happens in personalized medicine. It happens in identifying customers worthy of a special offer or recommendation or incentive. It happens in political science, characterize the voters which are swayable by a given slogan, so you wouldn't spend your campaign resources on non-swayable people who will vote for you anyhow, and things like that. Okay, so the identification of um, patients in need is typical to many, many uh, problem. And let me show you how we assign now uh, utilities to them. So assuming that this is survival from experimental data, okay, survival data, okay,
Yeah, Judea,
yeah,
we're running a little late, so we might have to wrap up at some point. We might lose the room too.
yeah, okay. So I'm going to just say that we have
Sorry, I want to leave time for a couple of questions.
just a couple of minutes, okay, that we have now a procedure for assigning utilities to each one of these happening and combining them in such a way. Here are the utilities alpha, beta, gamma, delta. We are assigning them to a different subpopulation or to a different character of individual. We ask him what is the social utility of selecting an individual in that kind of subpopulation, that kind and that kind, combine them, bing, bing, and get the bounds. Look at these bounds, okay, and then making a decision on the basis of this bound. I'll end up with my conclusion that taking from Gary King in Harvard, professor of political science, and he had the guts to make this statement, sweeping statement, that more has been learned about causal influence in the last few decades than the sum total of everything that has been learned about it in all prior recorded history. Wow, some people uh, uh, criticize him for being so sweeping, but I think he's absolutely right. Not only that, but I'll take the liberty of telling you that I feel that medicine is on the brink of major revolution, as we can now answer situation-specific questions that scientists have always longed to ask but couldn't. And the answer is in the calculus. And right here, the Book of Why, if you have a chance to read it. If not, just ask me now any question and I'll be happy to answer them if I can. Thank you very much for your attentive presence.